Hello, workers of the world. My name is James Mastriani.
And my name is Matt Newell.
And we are writers and performers and comedians and also hosts of the show Good Work, a laid-back conversational roundtable presented by the century-old newspaper, The Chief.
Yeah, we're going to be discussing labor politics, what it means to be a worker in America, and more. Everything with a pro-worker slant.
Join us and producer Jake on Good Work on Dragon Wagon Radio.
Or wherever you get your podcasts.
Wherever you get them.
Wherever you can get them.
It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Steven Sabel.
Welcome back, fellow Quillers, to Don't Quill the Messenger, your favorite Shakespearean-based podcast. Before I introduce today's guest, I do want to conduct a little bit of business. Everyone here at Don't Quill the Messenger and Dragon Wagon Radio is so humbled by the amount of support you all provide as loyal listeners and patrons of the show. Those of you who have signed up at our Patreon account, even at the $5 per month level, that helps us offset the costs of producing this great content for all of you, and so we thank you so much for that. If you haven't signed up yet, what are you waiting for? Head on over to don'tquillthepodcast.com. Click on the Patreon link there on the homepage, and you'll see a variety of exclusive perks available only to patrons, including our growing list of monthly bonus features. This month's bonus feature is a real treat and an exclusive taste of some magnificent symphony music dedicated to the Earl of Oxford. It's a beautiful bonus feature. Make sure you subscribe to get access to that. Don't forget that patrons at select levels are entered into our Quiller of the Month contest, and our monthly winner receives an item of their choosing from our Quiller swag shop, as well as a shout out on the show. Later in the program, producer Jake will join us to explain the patron levels and the structure for those who may be unsure of which level they wish to join at. This month's Quiller of the Month is John Foss, who is also one of our recent guests on the program. In fact, you can be a guest too. Do you have something to share? You can be a guest right here on the program. Just send me an email with your programming suggestions to contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com, contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com. And you could be a guest. You may have a suggestion for a guest. You may have a suggestion for a bonus feature. You may have a suggestion for an episode where you want me to dissect a certain play and explain its relevance to Edward de Vere or to the authorship question. I love to hear from you all. Contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com. But right now, let's go ask some questions. My guest today is a structural engineer and a mathematician from Portugal. After graduating from universities in Europe, he became a project manager and project director in the building industry, delivering projects which total in the tens of billions of dollars. Yes, that's billions with a B, ladies and gentlemen. Tens of billions of dollars throughout Europe, Africa, and Asia. His vast list of Superfund projects include nuclear, oil and gas, harbors, yes, like ship harbors, heavy industry, giant skyscrapers, residential complexes, hospitals, shopping malls, military installations, stadiums, schools, and even, this is my favorite, a theater. All in some of the most exotic locations in the world. Always on site, our guest headed teams of anywhere between 1,000 to 10,000 workers at a time, winning several construction awards along the way. As an independent scholar and an admirer of Shakespeare, whose work he has assiduously, that's his word, I love that word, by the way, he has assiduously studied for decades, our guest came to know about Edward de Vere approximately 5 years ago, and since then has written 5 extremely comprehensive essays full of new discoveries. His latest and final essay, a detailed work full of new groundbreaking revelations deriving from all arts and sciences, was conceived to be his conclusion to the Shakespeare authorship question. Having spent most of his life around the world, he now lives under the Mediterranean sun in his native Portugal, where he continues his lifelong literary and artistic work. And today, ladies and gentlemen, all the way from Portugal, let me welcome Luis Sousa to the program. Luis, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure, Steven. Thanks for having me, and hello to all the listeners.
You are such an illustrious guest. I'm so thrilled, and you're my fourth international guest, my first from Portugal, obviously. But it just goes to show, Quiller Nation, that we are more than a Quiller Nation. We are a Quiller world. And Luis was kind enough to join us across the seas, as it were, to be the special guest for today. Luis, let's talk about some of your research and findings, which have been fascinating to me, especially in that you touch on subjects and revelations I can't recall ever seeing or hearing from any other source. And I've been doing this for a while now. You work on your work on some of the details of the plays themselves, I think, digs deeper into the political and social themes behind the works, as well as identify some of the real life Elizabethan personalities that characters in the plays are based on. And I've mentioned on the program before your work on The Tempest. And one of the things that blew my mind was when I read your stuff on The Tempest, and you make such a strong case that Caliban, the fishman, is actually a depiction of King James I as sort of an usurper of the throne in a way, in the whole succession issue of the crown.
Yes, Stephen. The Tempest is indeed a highly complex work. The whole canon itself is from an incredibly intelligent man. I don't think people actually understand how intelligent Edward de Vere actually was. We're dealing with something, genius naturally is the topmost you can reach, but this is a man that not only was a genius, but he knew quite a lot about us here in the Mediterranean. He understood us as a people. And my research is like a Mediterranean take, an Italian take on the Shakespearean canon. Because throughout all my life, studying the works for decades, there were indeed some Italian elements in the play that I could not really understand. But when I discovered Edward de Vere 5 years ago and started going through the plays, especially this one, The Tempest, was the one that caught my attention, I realized that there were things that one could actually push and solve. And this was my third essay, was on Caliban, where I believe I have successfully demonstrated with full mathematical probability, that's 100%, that indeed Caliban is a depiction of James I of England and James VI of Scotland. In this, my final essay, I brought this and all the other essays I had written before back, and I presented even further arguments taken from historical sources that all prove without question that indeed James is Caliban. Now, I don't know if you want to go into detail on why James is Caliban.
Well, give us a few items, and then we'll obviously share more information with listeners before the end of the program. But give us a few items just so that we can get a grasp of where that comes from and what led you to that decision.
Certainly, my pleasure. The most obvious argument is the name itself. Stephen, there's this obsession normally with scholars, superficial scholars, that they look in the clouds for what actually lies at their feet. And this is actually, and unfortunately, a very common mistake. Now, Caliban, that most people, they hint at Michel de Montaigne's work. They try to make up Caliban like a cannibal, an anagram of cannibal. This is all wrong. It doesn't even make sense. There are no people on the island apart from Miranda, Prospero, and Caliban, and Ariel, of course. So this man could never be a cannibal. There's no reference, no hint on the play that Caliban ever was a cannibal. Indeed, Caliban is an anagram. It's an anagram of Albanique. Now, what exactly is Albanique? Albanique is someone that comes from Alba, and Alba is the ancient name for Scotland. That's the hint. Albanic is someone that comes from Scotland. Caliban is Scottish. Then, equally interesting, okay, I've listed on this my third essay about Caliban, let's say about 10 very conclusive mathematical arguments, and I concluded my argument by explaining that James, the sixth of Scotland, he was son to Lord Darnley, the husband of Mary Stuart, and Lord Darnley was the Duke of Albany. And when Darnley died, James VI inherited the title of his father, and he became Duke of Albany. Again, we have Albany, Albanique. So Albanique from Scotland, Albany from the Dukedom of Albany. But of course, there are many, many other hints. Caliban is designated in the personae as a deformed monster. Now, I don't know how far the scholars that postulate some common errors have gone down James' life, but indeed, James was deformed. If you read the biography of James, James had actually a tongue deformation. So, just like James, Caliban was deformed. Everything is tied correctly. The speech patterns of Caliban correspond with the physical impediment that James had. And, this thesis was received well by some. Others took a little bit of a dim view. But, Stephen, there's a common saying in finance, which is everyone can have his opinions, but no one can have his own facts. So against
I love that. That's great. And that does sum up some of the issues with certain folk involved in the Shakespeare authorship question on both sides of the coin, and in other areas where there have been other candidates pushed forward. I think that you raise a good point there as part of the problem.
Oh, thank you, Stephen.
And I'm fascinated. I think that those comments right there about Caliban and the connection to James are fascinating. I think they coincide. Now, that maybe this is me trying to find justification for my own beliefs, but I believe they coincide with the inherent nature of this mystery, which is the reason for the Shakespeare name. And I believe that the true reason for the Shakespeare name can be found in the original two poems. And I believe if you look at those two poems and you understand what they are intending and what their message is, then I think you understand why the author created the pseudonym to hide behind in order to put these poems out there, and both dedicated to the Earl of Southampton. And so you need to look right there first as to what all this means and where it comes from and why. The key to it all is the relationship between the author and the Earl of Southampton. And if you believe, as I believe, that the Earl of Southampton is in some way involved in the succession question, then it makes it very easy to take a look at The Tempest and see that the author was not a fan of King James becoming King James I of England.
Well, of course, who would be when De Vere had his own son, Henry Southampton? and had long fostered the idea that he would once be on the throne. To see James VI coming down to become king, of course, he wouldn't be happy with that. But some of your other guests, Stephen, have always mentioned the fact that this is really a very complex question, and indeed it is. To deconstruct Edward de Vere's work is not a simple matter. Like what I've just said about Caliban is really just a small fraction of my work on it, because we have very precise information about historical events in this Tempest play that have not been understood for 400 years. And yes, The Tempest is Edward de Vere's final play. There is incredible amount of information about how de Vere felt about everything that was taking place in England. I mean, it's by itself, The Tempest. You could write 10 essays because it's such an inexhaustible source of information. And the name Shakespeare, it's actually complex where it came from. Undoubtedly, the two poems have a very important part to play, undoubtedly. But sometimes I wonder if de Vere had not another thing in mind.
Well, now back to The Tempest for just a second. I know that you're aware that this year the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship is going to be holding their annual conference in Ashland, Oregon, which happens to be in my backyard. It's about 40 minutes from where I live. And one of the plays that the Oregon Shakespeare Festival is presenting this year is The Tempest, and part of the conference offerings are discounted tickets to see The Tempest. And I'm guessing that there's been some sort of a call or a request for presentations that would reflect upon The Tempest and help enlighten conference attendees about The Tempest. Have you shared your work on The Tempest with anyone with the organization, and have you been invited to give a presentation on The Tempest at the conference?
Well, I definitely have shared the work with other scholars, but I'm not entirely sure whether they have a tie to the organization. So I cannot really say so. But as for the invitation, no, I have not received an invitation. But you know, Stephen, I'm an independent scholar. I'm a very private man, and Oregon, it's very far away. I mean, it's
yes, it is very far away.
I checked. It was on the west coast of the U.S. It's really incredibly far. Even the eastern coast is pretty far, but you know, Stephen, my research is pretty widely available to some scholars if they feel like it's something that the public should be aware of. I have no problem sharing it with the interested in the public.
Well, that's a interesting concept there that I'm going to pursue a little further, because perhaps, and when we're offline, we can talk about this more, but perhaps there's something I can do to help share your research to the organization this fall, and in some way make it more available to people who would be interested in pursuing more about these themes of Caliban, King James as Caliban. And also you have some revelations about the role of Prospero. And you believe that a lot of people mistakenly connect Prospero with John Dee. And you have a different idea as to the origins of Prospero and who he's meant to represent. And I think those should be shared with scholars and enthusiasts who are interested in this topic as well.
Oh, definitely. I mean, about this of the conference and the Tempest. I mean, Stephen, my work is extremely it's actually extremely easy to present and to understand, but the problem is that it takes quite a long time. I mean, you could talk about 5 hours just on the Tempest, and probably you wouldn't even be halfway through all the revelations and all the discoveries I've done. Now, you know, Prospero as John Dee. You know, Stephen, this is also an error. The problem is that people, scholars, that are not from a mathematical background, that they don't understand what engineering is, that they didn't study philosophy in depth, especially critical philosophy, they don't understand what error is and where error comes from. Error is basically an inference from ground to the consequence and vice versa. And this has to do with concepts. So, because, you know, De Vere was an extremely intelligent man, he even deceives the public because he always has to have his laugh. Really, he loves to play. So, by putting this, defining Prospero as a magician, naturally, the first magician that's going to come to mind, it's John Dee. Now, the problem with this is that it simply doesn't work, because the work of this author is an extremely personal work. Anyone that is an artist understands that the only characters that are worthy to be in a great author's literary work are characters that either are the object of extreme hatred or love. John Dee doesn't fall into this category. John Dee, Edward de Vere certainly knew John Dee. We know this. But, you know, we have to start at the beginning. You know, Stephen, I discovered this, I call it the De Vere thing, in October 2016. It was on a Saturday. And let me tell you, Stephen, it took me 5 minutes to understand, to break exactly who Prospero was. Because people insist on making mistakes and looking for something that is not there. We have to use induction. Induction consists in the upward path, Shakespeare as De Vere. If you use deduction, you're trying to prove De Vere as Shakespeare. This is an unwarranted use of reason. So, why is Prospero Edward de Vere? It's actually very simple. If you are a poet, you are a master of words. And Edward de Vere's work, if people want to understand what the plays are about, they have to have an etymological dictionary. Etymology is not the meaning of words. Etymology is where the word comes from. So, for
Correct,
example,
the origins of words.
Yes. For example, my name, Louis, it means something along the lines of valorous warrior. Your name, Stephen, means something like garland, comes from garland. And Edward, our esteemed author, Edward de Vere, his name, he is the guardian of prosperity. He is, as we would say in Italian, custode prospero. Custode prospero. And De Vere used an incredibly intelligent device, because in the Dramatis Personae, he lists Prospero as the rightful Duke of Milan. If you look at this expression and you start deconstructing it from the etymological and from the linguistical point of view, you will get at exactly Edward de Vere, Duke of Oxford. And, you know, Stephen, I was a little bit surprised that it took 400 years to see this, but, you know, I attribute this to the fact that I'm not an English native, so I look at language from more of an Italian, a Mediterranean point of view. So there are things over here that are perhaps a little bit more clearer to us than the English.
I think that's the beauty, and that's one of the things that throughout our communications back and forth is one of the things that drew me to wanting you as a guest, because I think that's your multi-layers are incredible and so different from every other guest I've ever had. Like I mentioned before, approaching things from your architectural and mathematical background is one key component, but also from your Mediterranean background as well as your international connection to the many places in the world that you have lived and worked. And I think that provides a different perspective than somebody teaching at a university in the Midwest can possibly bring to the table. Now, it's not that you can't learn those things, but life experience is huge. And I think our author proves that. Look at his life experience. It's in the work. And how can we understand that life experience if we haven't had similar experiences? For instance, I can visit Italy. I could tour Italy up and down. I could probably spend several months there, but I wouldn't have the same understanding that Edward de Vere had of Italy, not only just from the historical perspective, but just in the amount of time spent there and living there, in the means and the way, and traveling by foot or by cart or by barge, as opposed to car or rail or plane. So I think that's a big aspect of it that you bring to the table that is, I hope, intriguing to my listeners and the entire Quiller Nation. I know it's definitely intriguing to me.
Oh, yes, Stephen. I mean, Edward de Vere, I look upon him. I hope the Italian listeners are not going to take this bluntly, but Edward de Vere is an honorary Italian. Let me explain. I am a born Latin. I know Italy extremely well. I know extremely well the Italian culture. And if I would have to give my opinion about this subject, I would say that compared with Edward de Vere, I'm actually a foreigner here. I've done an extensive work. In this, my final essay, I finally managed to understand who Edward de Vere really was as a man and as a person, exactly where he was deriving his knowledge, where his linguistics come from, why exactly are so many plays set in the Mediterranean. We're talking about, in the Mediterranean, we're talking about 20 plays. No, not in Italy and Greece. We're talking about 20 plays, and we're talking about 2 poems. So 20 plays, that's more than half of the canon. There's a lot of patterns here. This was a man that knew the culture extremely well. I know that to some extent people think that this is common knowledge, but I would like to tell everyone that this goes much, much further than anyone would actually believe if I were to say it on air without going deep into it. It's basically all about Italian. Stephen, it's about Italian, it's about Latin and Italy. In order to understand Edward de Vere, you need, to really understand him, you need 2 things. First, you need to speak Italian, and then you have to have lived in Italy for some time to check how we do things around there, because I don't know to what extent you will understand this, but the Mediterranean is a very different area from the rest of Europe. It's like a world apart. It has always been so. We have very different customs. And so long as you are evaluating the Oxfordian truth through English lenses, you will never be able really to reach at either the core of the canon or understand the man. And it was these 2 things that led me to conceive all my 5 essays.
So let me ask you, in your opinion, then, is Oxfordianism too English-centric? Are we blinded by our, and I put that word in quotes, by our Edward de Vere? We own him, he belongs to us. And are we short-sighted in that? And is that interfering with the progress and the research that could be done?
The short answer would be yes. But, I don't like to give conclusions without first giving the premises, which is the opposite of what I have just done. To all these questions, the answer is yes. But that doesn't mean that quite a lot of important things can be done without understanding the Italian culture. Of course you can, but you can only go so far. Because, my work, Stephen, I'm shocked about what I discovered. We can go through it later on, but
sure,
really you have to step away from the English world, and you have to consider Italy and Italian. And let me tell you one thing, Stephen, which really has disappointed me to some extent, is that you could not play this authorship problem in either Germany or Italy. It would be impossible. You cannot do. You could not, honestly. These sort of problems could never occur either in Germany, which are a mathematical and a fact-obsessed people, and Italians. How can I put this? We don't really believe and take everything at face value. Or actually, we don't take anything at face value. And I feel that for the most part, and believe me, there's incredible research out there from scholars, but I don't actually believe that all that Edward de Vere was as a man can be found in the available work, because there is simply too much in the Italian world that would make people simply shudder when they actually compare it with what it is on the plays. These are really very personal details about Italian life and Italian matrimonial dynamics. And in short, Stephen, you have to be a Latin to understand them.
Well, I can only think of one, maybe two members that I have come across or met or been exposed to through what I would call established Oxfordian channels that are from somewhere other than the United States, Canada, or the UK. I know I have a strong listener base down in Australia and some in New Zealand, but also that's part of the English-speaking world. So So it stands to reason that the English-speaking world is going to connect to this mystery in larger numbers, but it doesn't stand to reason that established Oxfordianism shouldn't be reaching out further to people like yourself who are interested in this and who can bring a new and different perspective like you're talking about. What should we be doing to reach the larger global audience?
Stephen, for me to be able to answer that question, I would actually have to be more familiar with your organization, which unfortunately I am not. My time is also very limited. I probably should have been also a little bit more active and engaging more with Oxfordians. So I probably half, I won't say blame, but I could take half of it. But essentially, there really could have been done or could be done quite a lot of things. But, Stephen, the public knows what it wants. And myself, thinking, if you ask me that question, I would say something that would appeal to me. Okay, if I was a member of the public, basically what I would like how about some versions of the Oxfordian works, the Shakespeare works from the Oxfordian point of view? I mean, PDFs, okay, I don't suppose there are copyrights for the works of Shakespeare. For example, my whole research on The Tempest would be completely free. And this work, if it was structured well, like divided into a few sections, like you'd have the text, then you have an independent section afterwards, after the text, just on the Oxfordian take. This is something that I think probably the public would be interested, because in fact there are very good editions of Shakespeare. I have about 20 different editions of the works. I mean, there's some.
Me too. I have 2 whole shelves that are just the complete works of Shakespeare, and different volumes and different editions and different publishers and editors.
Oh yes, I mean they start to grow. I mean, some of them are very good editions, but it's not really what I was looking for, because it's not from an Oxfordian point of view. I understand the public really always.
There are some great books. There are some great books out there that talk about the canon and go play by play and explain the connection to Edward de Vere, each play. Some of them more comprehensive than others. And there are versions of specific plays that have been produced and published that, explain the play from an Oxfordian perspective. But it sounds like what you're talking about is sort of a no fear Shakespeare version that is Oxford based. In other words, on one page is the original text, and on the opposing page is the literally like line by line or character by character explanation of how that connects to Oxford and why it has his name written all over it. Is that sort of the gist of what you're saying would be helpful? And then the follow-up question to that is, would it need to be in another language? Now, you obviously have an exceptional mastery of English, as well as, I'm sure, multiple other languages. But do we need to be putting something out there, if possible, in another language?
To this last question about the languages, I don't think it should be so. I think English would be fine. But the idea that you've just mentioned concerning the editions, I would be a little bit more diplomatic. I'm just thinking off the top of my head. That's why I said three parts of in this PDF version would be, a first part would be like the intro, keeping the grain man out of the whole work. The second part would be the text itself, and the third part would be the Oxfordian take. Why do I say only the Oxfordian take on the third section? Because the public may not be easily receptive if you come out with both guns blazing on Oxfordianism. So if they want just to read Shakespeare, okay, fine. You just take the 2 sections. You don't have to look at the third one. But if the third one is engaging enough, if, for example, it is appealing, like we may talk about one play in the episode, something that they could not take their eyes off. If they start reading it, they will finish it. Because, Stephen, I did not focus exclusively on The Tempest. I actually deconstructed every single play in the canon. I am aware that indeed Oxfordian deconstructions in single volumes and even in individual volumes of every single play, but my take is actually mostly radically different. In some cases, I even have to start with the premise that everything you've read about this play is false. So,
well, and I want to, at some point, I do have it here on my list that we're going to get to before the episode is over. I am going to ask you about your research on Macbeth, and I want you to share some of that. But before we get to that topic, I want to touch on this a little further, because I think it's so important to the future of the truth. And I think we're missing out by not reaching out to a larger global audience. I think one of the perspectives that you've shared with me as well is your grasp of world cultures and world history is so different from an English-based learning center, including you have referenced multiple scholars, historians, and scientists throughout history who have used a pseudonym to either hide behind or to at least create a shield for themselves in some of their work and some of their research, whether it was because of the biting satirical nature of it or the revolutionary findings of it. And I agree with you that we don't do enough to point that out to the world, that the idea of this pseudonym Shakespeare is so common in so many ways. You know, when I hear Oxfordians talk about, almost always it's George Orwell and Mark Twain. Well, yeah, those are two English-speaking writers who chose a pseudonym, and yes, those are examples. But there are examples throughout the world and throughout history that are far more important and more prominent that we just overlook or don't even mention, and I think that's a shame.
Oh, completely, Stephen. I mean, to be perfectly honest, if we are just referring always to the English-speaking world, you're leaving out a treasure trove of information, because the fact of the matter is that Americans indeed have a very long bond with England, be it in common history, be it in the language, in the culture, even biological relations. So in order to understand this, you have to stop being biased. You have to look at continental Europe, because England is not a species by itself. I mean, I think there are still people in Europe. I think there were people in continental Europe at the time of Shakespeare and before the time of Shakespeare. So if we start to see a pattern in pseudonyms, we don't actually have to focus exclusively on English-speaking pseudonyms. Like, I see that Oxfordians can mention, for example, two very prominent French writers, Molière and Voltaire, surely coming out after Shakespeare. But one should not simply mention them, because there's a lot of authors that either made use of pseudonyms or, you know, in some cases, they added this extra name to their own name. So, for example, in France, you have Molière, you have Voltaire, another one that everyone knows. We have Stendhal, we have George Sand, Rabelais, although it's not a pseudonym, he actually wrote under pseudonyms. Apart from France, we have, for example, in Germany, we have Novalis. That's a very famous poet. We have Jean-Paul. That's a very famous novelist. We have Melanchthon, which was one of the followers of Luther. You have Paracelsus. Paracelsus was a doctor. In Denmark, you have Copernicus that used to write under pseudonyms. You have the philosopher Søren Abbé Kierkegaard, who also used to write under pseudonyms. Also in France, you have Chamfort, you have La Bruyère. These two were names that they made up. Also publishing under pseudonyms, you have my favorite French author, Balzac. Here in Portugal, we have Fernando Pessoa. You have Miguel Torga. So this all follows a pattern, because if the public that's really interested in this question of the pseudonyms were actually to look at it from a mathematical and a critical point of view, they would realize that pseudonyms have always existed before Shakespeare, during Shakespeare, and after Shakespeare. And this was not only common to England, because what is valid for the individual is valid for the species. So that means that if these illustrious writers created pseudonyms for themselves, it means that there's actually something that is a pseudonym. That's the principle of sufficient reason, which has philosophical validity. Then it means that if it's valid for Europe, it's also valid for everywhere, because you cannot deny that there are, in fact, pseudonyms. And I feel a little bit disappointed that these names and this nature at pseudonyms outside the English-speaking world is not made more readily available.
I agree, and I'm so glad that, and just I hope my listeners are paying attention to how you were able to ramble off that list of great names from all over, most of Europe. And again, that just goes to demonstrate the type of different perspective and learning and knowledge that you have being a Latin and being someone who has traveled throughout and lived throughout Europe, especially as you point out, the Mediterranean. And I agree, the Mediterranean, I've not been there, but I do know a lot of people from a lot of places in the world. And I can tell you that they always talk about it being a completely different lifestyle. And though it is connected to Europe, it is not Europe in their minds. They don't see it that way at all. They might be a member of the EU, but Italians and Greeks do not see themselves at all as being comparable in any way whatsoever to French and German, for instance, as an example. And I think that you've hit on something that is a deficiency in those who are pursuing this issue. And I hope that those who are listening will take that to heart and start digging a little deeper into some of the names that you just mentioned, as well as some of the different cultural differences and aspects that play a part in this, including, as you say, and have mentioned earlier in the program, about Edward de Vere being honorary Italian. In fact, he was described as such by his contemporaries as the Italianate Earl. And I think that in some ways he was resented for his affinity for Italians, and he was accused of being a Catholic sympathist because of his love for Italy. And I don't know that you can have a love for anything Italian and not recognize the connection to Catholicism and the deep traditions that are involved there, regardless of the religiosity of it. The traditions, the pomp, the circumstance, the splendor, the grandeur of it is a connection to the society and the culture, whether you have strong faith or not. And I think that plays a big part. As you mentioned, 13 plays set in Italy, 20 total set throughout the Mediterranean, if you can include The Tempest, which I do. I think you're hitting on something that is so important to the movement.
Yeah, Stephen, you're absolutely right. Indeed, religion at the time of Edward de Vere indeed played, and Catholicism played a very important part in the Italian life, just as in Portugal and Spain. You mentioned before, to continue this analogy, and by extension to what you mentioned Macbeth. For example, let me give you an example of the short-sightedness, which is to some extent comprehensible because people are not from a Latin background. But let's look at the big problem. I mean, a really big problem of epic proportions that was created unnecessarily, which is Macbeth and the famous word equivocation. I mean, God blimey, I don't understand what is the problem with equivocation. This is a very simple thing to explain. If people actually understand some classic language or Italian, let me put it like this. This has nothing to do with Campion. This has nothing to do with the gunpowder plot. This has nothing even to do with England. The clue in the word equivocation is 3 letters, Q-U-I. If you see the letters Q-U-I, please accept that this is almost certain not an English word. This is a Latin word. So equivocation, where does equivocation come? Equivocation can have different derivations. Okay, if it's the Italian derivation, we say equivocazione. If it is Spanish, we will say equivocación. If it is Portuguese, we will say equivocação. This meaning that these 3 languages are deriving from the same classical language, that is the Latin. And in Latin, the word we have for equivocation is equivocatio, coming from aequivocare. Now, I don't know if it is just me, but it seems to me that there's a little bit of a pattern here, because I don't think Italians in the 16th century were copying the English, or the Portuguese or the Spanish were copying the English. So, of course, this word is derived from either the Latin or the Italian, and it has nothing to do with Campion or the gunpowder plot. That would be the same thing as, for example, I think it was the Scottish did the television, but I'm not entirely sure on this. Okay, if the Scottish invented the television, over here in Spain, we call it television. In Portugal, we call it televisão. This is absolutely the natural derivation. So when the word equivocation appears in Macbeth, this is someone that knew the Italian language extremely well, that is just making the absolute simplest derivation from the English language, from the Italian language into the English. Let me say it again. Equivocazione, equivocation. That's the easiest thing in the world. I don't know why people have to continue to look for far-fetched explanations for very simple linguistic issues.
That's a beautiful point. And again, it draws from that perspective of somebody who is fluent in multiple Latin-based languages, and so therefore can connect the etymology of the word to its Latin-based. And so equivocare is Latin, correct? And it means what?
Yes. It means exactly equivocate. Equivocate. Equivocare, it's equivocate.
And what we see here is some of Edward de Vere's neologism, but it's all based in his knowledge of Latin and Latin-based languages, most especially Italian.
Oh, yes, completely. I mean, he uses a lot of Latin puns, quite a lot of Latin puns, but it's whenever he really wants to go and have fun with a scene, he is always deriving from the Italian language. Almost always is the Italian language. It's absolutely impressive what he does sometimes.
Now that we've opened the door to Macbeth, let's go a little deeper into some of your research, because one of the things that really impressed me with your final essay were the sections on Macbeth and the deductions that you, not deductions, inductions, right? We're going to talk about your process in a little bit too as well, but I want you to share with the listeners some of the profound realizations that you have come across with regards to why Macbeth was written, who it was written about, and some of the very specific, and I would call them attacks on individuals in the Elizabethan court that the play was meant to level against those characters.
Okay.
Should we begin with Robert Dudley?
I think that we should first have one of those parental things on the show.
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, please cover the eyes and ears. Well, not eyes, this is an audio show, but please cover the ears of sensitive minds before proceeding forward with this version of the episode. We're going to get into some salacious stuff, huh, Luis? Is it starting? It's going to get sexy now? Is that what's about to happen?
Well, to say the least, and Steven, I must confess, I was actually quite flabbergasted when you told me that you wanted to talk about Macbeth, because, I hope that we don't get into problems with the American Podcast Association of America.
No, we won't. Trust me, there are. We really do not have censorship here on podcasts because they don't have to obey what we would call our FCC laws because they're not broadcast live over the air. They are a recorded program and people can choose to listen or not listen. And I doubt, some of the subject matter does get very adult, but it's, we obviously keep within the bounds of decency and stray away from anything that would be pornographic. Although, we've had episodes, including our episode on the two epic poems, the Venus and Adonis and Rape of Lucrece, that were, very hard hitting on the details of especially Venus and Adonis, which in its day was considered, practically pornographic, which is why it was such a popular poem and everybody was scrambling to get a copy. So I think we're going to be okay. But I do think that it's important to share what you have discovered and what you've written about with our listeners, because I think it's going to blow some minds wide open.
Okay, Steven, this is my take on Macbeth. I tried to refute it for almost a year, and at the end, I simply could not damage or hurt my thesis in any way. And if anything, every time I touched this Macbeth argument, new and more arguments popped up. So we're talking about pretty salacious things. And, this is really an extremely complex play and I can tell you, Steven, that it was definitely the biggest challenge in what deconstruction of the canon is concerned. By far the most complicated play and work to deconstruct, because this is the work of an absolute genius. Now, there's always been this question that what exactly is Macbeth really all about? Now, Steven, I don't know about you, but I was never actually satisfied with any of the interpretations or deconstructions that have been given in the last 400 years. I felt that there was really something missing all along. I remember definitely reading this play many decades ago when I was 16, and even in Portuguese. And even then I saw that there was something really extraordinary, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. It's like an unknown quantity, something that, we see passing behind the thick veil. We see something rapidly passing, but we don't actually can see what it is. And it took me a great deal of abstraction to understand this play. This is a very personal play. It indeed has what will call for now a something that is repeated obsessively over and over again in practically every scene, if not in every scene, and several times. Now, the problem with understanding this something, let me put it again, now that we're talking about the the English-like quality is that if you are from an English-speaking background, and you're a native English speaker, you probably will not be able to understand what De Vere was doing. Because let's take, for example, the first verse of the play, "When shall we three meet again?" from the Witches. Immediately, you will convert these words into abstract representations. You cannot simply hear them without converting them into images. Now, people that are not from a native English background can, to some extent, hear the sound, but not convert it necessarily to abstract representations. That's mental images. So, if you separate yourself from the meaning of the words and just consider Macbeth as mere sound, let's say, for example, we were at the theater and we were watching a play in either Russian, Arabic, Egyptian, and we kept hearing the same sounds over and over again in the play. And you would ask the man sitting by your side, what exactly is this sound that I'm hearing? What does it mean? And really, this sound is heard throughout Macbeth from beginning to end. Now, I understand to be able to understand that, you also have to have a very good grasp of music. But this is what I found is actually going to surprise some, because Steven, Macbeth is a dark play. It's...
Oh, yes, it is. And, in my experience as a producer and director, it is one of the most popular of all the plays when it comes to audience attendance. And it's a play that is produced more often than most because of how popular it is with audiences. Because of that popularity, it has developed a reputation for having been a cursed play. And the truth behind that is that many productions have resulted in some sort of tragedy, or in some cases even loss of life. But the reason for that is mathematical. It's produced far more often, and oftentimes throughout history has been produced by theaters that were struggling to survive, and so therefore fell to Macbeth as their saving grace production. And oftentimes it was under-rehearsed, not properly produced, which led to accidents that occurred. And so it became this self-fulfilling prophecy of the curse of Macbeth, that theaters would have these tragic things happen. And it was because they were rushing to get it on. They weren't rehearsing it properly. They were trying to use it as a way to save their bottom line and keep the theater doors from closing. And it resulted in problems in the production. And that's the true history of production of that play.
Oh, yes, Stephen, absolutely. And I can even tell you that not exclusively in the theater production of Macbeth, but even in opera, whenever Macbeth of Verdi was composed in the 1840s, everyone is looking over his shoulder. I mean, people can tell you whatever they want, but everyone is looking over his shoulder, because even in operatic productions of Macbeth, there's been deaths and there's been unexplainable incidents and accidents. And opera companies tend to have very large budgets, so this thing should not really happen. Fortunately for me, Stephen, even though I go to the opera frequently, I don't usually go to see Macbeth, because I know that some listeners are going to hate me for it, but it really doesn't work. There's I understand that vocalists love to sing it, but as an opera, I'm not entirely sure if it works. So whenever I find myself in an opera house listening to Verdi's Macbeth, Stephen, I think of the president that was once shot in a theater, and end up thinking that sometimes the real tragedy is actually going to see Macbeth at the opera house and not get shot.
That's funny you would say that, because that's Abraham Lincoln you're talking about. And P.S., his favorite Shakespeare play was Macbeth.
Oh, really?
So that's very, very interesting. That cracks me up. That is, Lincoln was known for reciting Shakespeare to his cabinet members. Sometimes in the words of one of his cabinet members who wrote a memoir, basically, I'm paraphrasing, but basically he would hold them hostage sometimes and make them sit there and listen to him recite passages from the plays. And one of the things I always love is Shakespeare killed Abraham Lincoln, because if you look at the history of the Booth brothers and their theatrical history, it was about 6 months before the assassination of Lincoln that the Booth brothers played the three major roles in a production of Julius Caesar, which probably helped spark the conspiracy that they needed to do away with this quote unquote tyrant. So in some ways, Abraham Lincoln loved Shakespeare, was his favorite writer. He loved Macbeth, but in the end, it was Shakespeare who did him in, because of the Booth brothers, including, one of the Booth brothers, Junius Brutus Booth, was named after Marcus Brutus of the fame of slaying Caesar. And that's part of the what they felt was their duty to their namesake and their country, to assassinate him. So that's a very interesting little factoid there.
Really? I didn't know that Macbeth was Lincoln's favorite Shakespeare play. Well, perhaps you would have loved to hear this podcast then.
He might have hated Verdi for that matter. Who knows?
Yeah, I know about John Wilkes Booth, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, correct.
He shouted, I think, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus end all tyrants. Now, I confess I don't know much about American history, so I cannot have any saying on what I don't understand, because I haven't really studied it. But Stephen, really, Macbeth is an incredibly dark play. It is a great play, but it has a very, very pronounced psychological component, which to some extent explains why it was only printed in the first folio in 1623. There is some records that it may have been performed around 1606, and it's actually possible, for all the real life characters were really deceased. What everyone must understand about Macbeth, if you consider my thesis, is that this play, though set in Scotland, has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with Scotland. It has absolutely nothing to do with James I of England or James VI of Scotland. It has nothing to do with the historical Macbeth. It has nothing to do with the Gowrie plot, the Darnley murder, or the Gunpowder plot. But as always, it has to do with the usual suspects in the English court. Because an author of genius will always derive from his own personal life. And this is an incredibly personal work. So, yes, over here, concerning Macbeth, I would actually say that everything that was written about Macbeth, one should consider, while I'm presenting these new facts, as false, and then the listeners should compare with what I'm saying with what they've heard before. And Stephen, I know that you have a very articulate and intelligent audience, so they can make their minds up. I don't need to tell them what to think, because it's not who I am. Macbeth...
Well, it begins with, "When shall we three meet again?"
Oh, yes. Well, it's a dark play, doesn't find any critics. And indeed, Macbeth has elements that are proper to Greek tragedy, is a dark play, and it has a very interesting anthropological background. Now, this when shall we three meet again? It's said by the witches. Macbeth indeed is related to one of Aeschylus' plays from the Oresteia, which is Agamemnon. Agamemnon starts with a watchman, and there are some invocations both in the watchman and the witches. And the watchman, his complaint is that he's waiting for Agamemnon to come back from the Trojan War, and he complains that he simply wants to sleep. He wants to close his eyes. So there are many Greek mythological elements in Macbeth, but they are not usually well understood or realized because people are looking.
Now, I will say we do have a prior episode where Dr. Earl Showerman was my guest, and he's been a guest multiple times on the program. And we did do an episode about the Greek connections to Macbeth, and he talked a lot about the bird imagery that you find in the play, and I believe he mentions Aeschylus, and I believe he mentions Agamemnon. So you two are coinciding with that, but I think you take things a little deeper when you talk about who it connects to in the Elizabethan court as well, right?
Oh, definitely. But Stephen, to understand this play, let me just say the following. This is a play that has a lot of anomalies. It is one of the very few plays in the canon that has no songs. That's very strange. Then it's the only play in the canon that I cannot see a subplot in this play. All other plays have subplots. This one follows the Greek tragedy model. It has no subplot. The Malcolm and the Macduff scenes, this is still the main plot. Now, what I have proposed, my proposition is, without more ado, Macbeth is a play about an event that took place in the author's family life. It's something that I've studied for a very long time, and which I found patterns in several other plays. And this is about the rape of his first wife, Anne Cecil de Vere. Now, I know that this may come as a shock, Stephen, but if we consider the elements that the author presents, really the problem is that there's simply too much that points in this direction. So what exactly is Macbeth about? If you, apart from the rape, yes, who is Macbeth? Well, Macbeth is Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. The problem with this, it's actually very easy to come to this conclusion, because this something that I mentioned before, Stephen, these are two sets of sounds that constantly appear in this play Macbeth, which are eyes and sea in all its possible variations. And believe you me, the author had a lot of fun with this. So, the first line spoken by Macbeth: "So foul and fair a day I have not seen." Okay, you have the first line of Macbeth. You have the sea sound. The final line of the whole play, which should be "to see us crowned at Scone." Again, you have the sea sound, but it doesn't end there. It's like Macbeth, he cannot speak a line without going either to eyes or to sea. For example, let me just give you just a few examples. And why is this related to Robert Dudley? Because Robert Dudley's nickname given to him by Elizabeth was Eyes. So this theme of the eye.
She called him her eyes. That was
Oh,
she
yes.
had nicknames for a lot of people, and she referred to him as her eyes.
Oh, yes, completely. And let's just look at a few expressions that Macbeth or Dudley uses concerning eyes. You have the eye, wink at the hand. Yet let that be which the eye fears when it is done to see. Then the very famous line, is this a dagger which I see? I see another one, I see thee still, I see thee yet. Prithee, see there, behold, look, lo. Then you have column, let me see him. Then you have I'll see no more, and some I see. Then I continue, now I see 'tis true. Then you have whiles I see lives, and in eyes, mine eyes are made the fools of the other senses. Is it the bloody business which informs thus to mine eyes? What hands are here? Ha, they pluck out mine eyes. Then you have show his eyes and grieve his heart. Start eyes. And even in the names of the characters themselves, Macbeth, a part of the inspiration comes from Holinshed's history. Even in what names of characters are concerned, indeed, Seward appears in Holinshed, but Macbeth's henchman Seaton does not come in Holinshed, and Shakespeare just introduced it to insert like half a dozen more C sounds into the text, because he actually has a lot of fun with this. One of my favorite lines in the play is, Seaton, I am sick at heart when I behold. Seaton, I say. Now, to a native English speaker that doesn't speak continental languages, this is actually an impressive line, but if we actually start to deconstruct it carefully, you will see the first word, Seaton. Now, you have the C sound, that stands to any reason. Then you have ton. Ton, that's French for sound. He's basically saying, C sound. Then he has, I am sick at heart. You have the I, which is the me, but you can also have the I. So he's actually effectively saying, I am truly the I. Then he goes on and say, when I behold. When, and then again you have the I, and behold, you again have another reference to seeing, and then he stresses again what he just said, see sound, I say. He's really forcing this onto the audience. It's really, really clear what is intended. Then even the expression that Macbeth first gives when he first comes onto the play, the so fallen fair day I have not seen, is actually, you could almost see in it a description of Dudley as a man, because he was reputedly a very handsome man, but he was also considered very foul, for he was both a villain and as some believe, a murderer.
I definitely believe he was a murderer, and most likely his weapon of choice was poison.
Well, poison definitely has had quite a lot of advantages back then, because there was no really an effective toxicology, so you could actually manage to get away with it. And
it's most probable that, the biographies explain that he and Elizabeth had a very solid relationship, and definitely a physically intimate and romantic relationship. There is documented evidence that she flipped a nut when she found out that he was married. And there's some evidence that he murdered his wife in order to free himself up so that he could try to be king. I think he had that ambition. He had that Shakespearean Macbeth-like ambition to want to rule the throne. And I think that that's an easy step to make when you look at your analysis and when you look at the life of Dudley and how it all played out.
Oh, yes, entirely, Stephen. Everything you say is correct indeed. Dudley was king. He was de facto king. He may not have had a crown, but he was definitely acting as a king. And to some extent, Liz Tudor was able to control him together with Burleigh. But, you know, there's so much information about these real-life characters in the canon of Shakespeare that in order to understand exactly who they were, we just have to listen to the bard and deconstruct the play. It's almost like you don't need history books. Okay, this may be a very subjective take because no one is entirely bad, no one is entirely good, but surely there were quite a lot of very dark points concerning Dudley, and I don't think this would be the man you would want to cross. Now, what further parallels are there between Dudley and Macbeth? Okay, Macbeth is introduced as a warlord, and so was Dudley. Macbeth rose through the ranks, and so did Dudley. You know, Dudley was the master of the horse, and in the play he has very awkward expressions concerning horses that you would probably not expect to hear from a king. You would actually expect to hear them from the master of the horse, which the lines are, "I wish your horses swift and sure of foot, and so I do commend you to their back, and send out more horses, scur the country round." And even equally interesting is the way Shakespeare describes Dudley. Now, towards the end of the play, Macduff calls Macbeth Hellhound. Hellhound.
Yes.
Turn, Hellhound.
Turn, Hellhound. Turn.
And you know,
sure.
Once you actually start to look at this, these things don't just appear in the canon by chance, because you have the Hellhound. Okay. And what about the famous line of Macbeth to the murderers? "Aye, in the catalogue you go for men, as hounds and greyhounds, mongrels, spaniels, curs, shafts, water-rogs, and demi-wolves are clept all by the name of dogs." You know, one actually might see that there is something in this, and the logical inference, not deduction, inference would be to see if exactly there was anything connecting Dudley with dogs. And, you know, Stephen, just takes a little bit of research to find that, in effect, this is actually going to surprise you. Dudley was referred by Elizabeth as a dog. The words of Elizabeth were, "I cannot live without seeing you every day. You are like my little dog. As soon as he is seen around, people know that I am coming. And when you are not seen, they say, I'm not far off." And this is the only reference that Liz made of a man as a dog. Pretty interesting stuff, isn't it, Stephen?
Yes, indeed. It is indeed. Now, you mentioned, I happen to agree with you. I believe that Robert Dudley was definitely Anne Cecil's rapist, and I'm not alone in that belief. And we have a great episode with Dorothea Dickerman where we talk about the rape of Lucrece, and that being the very depiction of the same event. And what I would ask then is, where is Anne in Macbeth, or is she present at all? Is she Duncan, the king, who has been? How does that play out in your mind?
Okay, Stephen, I will keep repeating the same thing. Shakespeare is really intelligent. You know, indeed, Anne is Duncan. Now, you know, whenever, perhaps in the text, we may find it strange, but when we see the play performed, either on film or live, I mean, there's something really, really strange. There's something really feminine about Duncan. Okay, the last two letters of Anne, they're a dead giveaway. Then the Dunk, I will not force this argument, but the dunk might be construed as the Italian dunque, meaning thus or so. But, Stephen, I think you've realized that in the scenes between Banquo and Duncan, there's something really awkward. It seems like almost the character playing Banquo has to leave the role and address Duncan in a very awkward way. Duncan, the historical Duncan, died in the battlefield. Now, this Duncan is not even fighting in the play. He just appears with his nobles. He never fights. Then what?
Well, and Shakespeare takes two Malcolms and combines them into one, right? Because there's Malcolm the First and then Malcolm the Second. And so historically, he takes a lot of liberties with history. And that's why I agree with you that this play has nothing to do with the historical Macbeth, and it has nothing to do with Scotland, because it is so all over the map when it comes to the real history of the man and the time, that it's just a construct. It's a veil for him to, and I think you're right. I think when you look at the number of I's and the number of C's, it's almost as if Edward de Vere is stabbing Dudley with every single one of those references, as if he wants to stab him 1,000,000 times to death. Death by 1,000 cuts, as it were.
This is totally a revenge play. Let me give you. I have dozens and dozens of arguments on Macbeth as Dudley. One that it should be especially impressive to the readers, the listeners. I think they will appreciate this. Is an image that Macbeth invokes towards the end of the play when he's fighting the Malcolm and the English army, which the image is, they have tied me to a stake. I cannot fly, but bear-like I must fight the course. Okay, Shakespeare here is he's really diverting the attention of the readers in the play. But if you really pay attention to these words, okay, they have tied me to a stake, I cannot fly, but bear-like I must fight the course. Stephen, the obvious thing that one does when one reads this, and one is actually intending to understand this play, one just has to do a little bit of research to see if Dudley was at all connected to this image. Stephen, it takes 5 minutes to do this research. You just have to look at Dudley's crest of arms, and you will see at the top of the crest of arms of Dudley a muzzled bear tied to a stake, just like Macbeth depicts himself. You cannot make this stuff up, Stephen.
Right. And we know that Edward was big about crests and mottos, because they come out throughout the canon regularly. Obviously, his own, the boar, is super important. That's, and what about Dudley's motto? I don't know what Dudley's motto is, but it must appear somewhere in the play then.
Dudley's motto, I can't remember it from the top of my head. I'll have to check it. But someone out there listening is shouting it right now at their headphones or at their speaker system. I'd be willing to bet that if Bonner Miller Cutting is listening to this episode, she's shouting it out and she knows it by the back of her heart. But I'm curious now. I doubt it not, Stephen.
Look up his motto.
I doubt it not, but the fact of the matter is, of course, I checked the motto and I could not find any tie to this specific play. Because Shakespeare doesn't do cheap tricks. He's extremely intelligent. He doesn't play around. If he uses these images, he stretches it up to a point. Perhaps the motto here would be something too much. Even there are other elements in Robert Dudley's crest that are also referenced in the play. Robert Dudley loved the muzzled bear symbol. And basically, Shakespeare truly knew what he was doing, because in Macbeth, it's all about ambivalence. Even Shakespeare doesn't hide this. How many times, if we go and look at the text and check how many times the word double appears on the text, I mean, it appears quite a lot of times. It seems to be an indication that there is a double entendre, double meaning. Even towards the end, Shakespeare tells us exactly what it's all about. He says he complains to himself, and be these juggling fiends no more believed than patter with us in a double sense. Double sense. I mean, you cannot really make up this thing is simply too obvious. Now, returning back to Duncan, indeed, Shakespeare here also has a lot of fun in the text, and I've looked very carefully into Anne Cecil de Vere's life. I've put under the magnifying glass of critical philosophy and an actual working method and system. And what I found about Anne, very simple. The first thing, where does this name Anne come from? What is its etymological derivation? Now, the name Anne comes from grace. And throughout the play, Duncan is constantly referred to with this description as being gracious. He says, shall continue our graces towards him. When Duncan is killed, renown and grace is dead. Macbeth says, for them the gracious Duncan have I murdered. Then one of the nobles says, the gracious Duncan was pitied of Macbeth. Another one of the nobles to kill their gracious father. So there's definitely a tie between Duncan and Anne Cecil de Vere. But it goes actually a lot further, because in what Holinshed is concerned, practically the only elements that Shakespeare takes from Holinshed are the names, because almost everything else in the play is very, very different. In Holinshed, Duncan was killed in the field of battle. Although the other source of inspiration, which was the Chronicle of King Duff and Donwald and his wife, in this description, indeed, King Duff is murdered in the bedroom. Then, very interestingly, is you would have really to go into a lot more detail, but in the account of Holinshed, he says that King Duff had 4 servants. Now, Shakespeare made him 2. It is as easy, really, to write 4 as 2. But there's a very interesting reason why Shakespeare uses that 2. I believe he uses 2 is just to symbolize consciousness, because I actually believe that the rape was effective when Anne was either drunk, drugged, or unconscious, because Shakespeare tells us that when Duncan is murdered, the servants, these 2 servants, which I believe are supposed to represent consciousness, he says, their drenched natures lie as in a death, unguarded Duncan.
Lady Macbeth says that which hath made them drunk hath made me bold.
Oh, yes.
And it almost as if Lord and Lady Macbeth are both Dudley in some way. They are connected to each other. And truly, as far as relationships go of man and wife, they are one of the most passionate couples in the entire canon, I have to say. And you cannot produce the play, and you should not produce the play without there being a visceral connection between the 2 of them that is lust-based and nearly animalistic in nature.
Oh, indeed, Macbeth and and Lady Macbeth are undoubtedly linked, and in both the historical characters and the characters in the play. And
she does say, I will drug their possets. And remember, now we're talking about Dudley, and he was known as a poisoner. And so it does stand to reason that he may have drugged Anne in order to take advantage of her. And what also would make sense is that it had to have taken place in such a way that he was in double, what's the word that Macbeth uses there? But he basically says, I'm in double fault here. Yeah, he's here in double trust. Right. So he defies that double trust, which makes me wonder if Dudley wasn't a guest in the Cecil home when this happened.
I actually believe there are very interesting elements in the play where the rape was actually effected. And there are very thorough details. I think we can discuss them, but really these are truly salacious. The scene before the great dagger soliloquy, Macbeth meets Banquo, and again, it's just amazing what Shakespeare does, because there are references to the moon going down. Now, the moon going down, a line of Banquo, can be constructed as the loss of virginity. And as you know, Stephen, Anne Cecil de Vere was a virgin when de Vere left for Italy. Then another interesting element we get from this scene between Banquo and Macbeth is an unnecessary fact, an unnecessary reference. He could have left this out, but he inserts it because he does it for a reason. And Shakespeare tells us that Banquo has a sword. He didn't need to tell us this, but he tells us that he has a sword. So apparently you are permitted to carry a sword in the Macbeth's castle. But when Macbeth goes into his great soliloquy, he decided not to do the murder with a sword. He decided to do it with a dagger. And there's a lot of interesting elements in this soliloquy. And pardon me the pun, but I could say there is a lot more here than meets the eye. So
wait a minute. I'll go where you are pretending you don't want to go. So here, are you telling me that Shakespeare makes a joke about the size of Robert Dudley's penis? He's telling him he doesn't have a sword, he has a dagger?
No, he's not going there. The dagger really has nothing much to do with manhood, but okay, if we were to consider the manhood element, indeed, there until the murder of Duncan is committed, this play is going off the scale in innuendo and sexual puns. So I've already mentioned the moon going down as a pun on the loss of virginity. Then you have drain him dry. You have prick the sides of my intent. You have being a man and being so much more than a man. These are all explicit sexual references. But when it comes to the dagger...
Lady Macbeth emasculates him when he says, no, I'm not going to do it. She tears him apart. She emasculates him. She basically says, you are not really a man then. You don't deserve to have a penis, is basically what she says, in not so many words, and convinces him. And he says, bear men children only, right? Because he realizes, wow, you are wicked. You should never have a female child because she will be more venomous than you are. You need to bear only male children.
Oh, yes, that's very well pointed out, Stephen. And I would even say, following on what you just said, that's very interesting, that this dynamics, even between Macbeth and his lady, follows more our own Latin relations than exactly the Northerner relations. Shakespeare, when he thinks of marital dynamics, he most often has our own Southern conception. You'd really have to study.
I
and
agree
live
with that.
among-
I absolutely and fully agree with that. And there is a totally different concept there as to how the home is managed and how household finances were taken care of, and the way that servants were managed and handled. I agree. There was a much greater balance, I believe, between the patriarchy and the matriarchy in Italy and in the Mediterranean than there is in a highly patriarchal England.
Yes. I mean, one day we could discuss this more thoroughly. But, I wouldn't want Latin listeners to think that I'm just spilling all our secrets. They're not really secrets, but these are really very personal dynamics. For example, we Portuguese and Spanish have a different dynamics from the Italians. It's different. Shakespeare always follows the Italian. He doesn't follow the Iberian. That's the Portuguese and the Spanish. His conception is always Italian. So coming back to this dagger soliloquy, what we need to understand about the dagger is that the dagger, I think this is common knowledge, it is a phallic symbol. Now, it's very strange why Shakespeare gives a dagger to Macbeth. You cannot explain the dagger element, knowing that there are swords about, and you can carry a sword. He does it because it's a phallic symbol. But, there's a lot more related to daggers. When you fight with a dagger, this involves close combat. With a sword, you can fight dispassionately. I can tell you that people can easily, if they want to murder someone, they can easily and dispassionately do it with a sword to some extent. But with a dagger, it's a very, very different dynamics. First, it involves close combat. Things can get messy very easily. And the result is always very uncertain. But the issue is that it's simply too personal, where with a sword, it's detached because you are distant from your opponent. Now, this phallic symbol and the entire speech of Macbeth is just a phallic symbolic invocation, meaning, i.e., it's basically an invocation of an erection. The interesting thing about what Shakespeare does is that Macbeth is supposed to see a dagger, but if you look at the first folio, you see no indication of a dagger appears. And usually Shakespeare gives you these scenic references. In the dagger speech, he doesn't. So, what we need to understand also is what happens when someone intends to commit murder using a dagger. I know this is very graphic, but if you want to understand that, we need to go really to the bottom of things. If anyone reads any murder report involving a dagger, you will immediately notice that it's never just a single hit. Whoever intends to commit murder with a dagger always strikes several times. I mean, I know that this is very salacious. Then you get
but you're absolutely right. You're in close and you give several thrusts. You stab multiple jabs into vital organs to make sure that your opponent bleeds out.
Yes, because a single hit does not necessarily signify death. So if you want to get the job done, you have to hit more than once. Then, as I mentioned before, Shakespeare also mentions that the king is abed. So not only we get this image of the dagger going in and out of Duncan's body, but Shakespeare also clearly and very obviously tells us that the king is abed. Now, I don't know if it is just me, but this seems like an analogy of sexual intercourse of a violent nature. You have the phallic-like dagger entering in and out of the character that's supposed to represent Anne and is in bed. But Shakespeare doesn't leave it there, because he follows this even with more information. I would say even unnecessary information. He could have kept it for himself, and he would have saved me the trouble of going through this very salacious detail. He says that he addresses the dagger and he says, "I see thee still, and on thy blade and dudgeon gouts of blood, which was not so before." Now, in order to understand what exactly is meant with this, we need to have a look at the physiology of De Vere's day. Now, what are these gouts of blood? First, he could have left gouts out. He could have just said blood. The effect would be the same, but he uses the words gouts of blood. So obviously, if indeed my proposition stands to reason, if the dagger indeed is a phallus, then the gouts of blood would necessarily have to be male seminal fluid. And I will proceed
Well, also,
to explain.
if Anne, and of course, Anne is definitely a virgin at her marriage. There's no doubt about that. William and Mildred, I am certain, kept her fully protected and made sure that she was a virgin on her wedding night. And we know that Edward refused to consummate the marriage and runs off to Italy. So she's a virgin in that bed.
Oh.
And when Dudley rapes her, there is going to be evidence of such for her first sexual encounter.
Oh.
And you're right, it's very salacious and it's very graphic, but the gouts of blood upon the dagger certainly are going to be evidence. In fact, in that day, they would have witnesses come and watch a couple consummate a marriage to prove that she was a virgin by pulling the bloody sheets out from underneath them after it was over. I mean, this is not unheard of in those times. And so you're right, the graphic information he provides there. But imagine this man who is so embittered by this knowledge that he has now come to learn that this man violated his wife in this way, and he's tongue-tied by authority. There's not much he can do except this. He can do this. He can write this play and put it out there for all to see, pun intended, before him.
Oh, yes, Stephen. Exactly. You know, genius always finds an outlet. If you cannot get justice in courts, and certainly you wouldn't get justice from Elizabeth, there's always poetical justice, and that is something, because will the contemporary audience understand what the author is trying to convey or not? It's irrelevant. The Shakespearean canon and the man are one. If you understand the canon, you understand the man. And this is what a lot of people usually fail to understand. So this is an extremely personal work. And this play, especially this play, Macbeth, is a confession. The author is pouring his anguish out on this work. And Well, I'm a little bit surprised that it took 400 years to crack this thing, but better late than never. But coming back
And so
to
many other of the plays involve this and are surrounding this. This was a traumatic incident in their lives. He refused to accept that child for the first 5 years of her life because he knew it wasn't his daughter, but then comes around and accepts and understands that that's not the child's fault, that the child is a product of a rape, and comes to love her dearly, in fact. I think as much as, if not more than the other daughters who come later, is based on, the way he tries to arrange for her the best circumstances and best life he can. And I think that you see the apologies over and over again throughout the canon. You look at plays like Pericles, you look at Winter's Tale, you look at Measure for Measure. Like he apologizes to Anne and to his daughter Elizabeth over and over again for having taken the position he took for those 5 years of alienating them. And he tries to make up for it as much as he possibly can throughout his writing and throughout the rest of his life. It's one of the great passions of this truth, that this man is the author. And it's one of the things that, as a parent, drives me to want to share that truth with the world, because this is so deep and so intense. And as you say, so highly personal. And the idea that, the Grain Man, I love how you call him the Grain Man. The idea that the Grain Man from Stratford, like, it's so ludicrous and ridiculous that it's offensive to me.
Well, Stephen, I think it will give us hope to every single one of us. So, because if there's out there any very great writer, who knows, maybe 10 years from now, the authorship will be attributed either to you or me or any of the listeners. Who knows? May happen.
Well, one of the things that's going to need to change, Luis, is that those who are in the establishment have got to change their focus. One of the biggest problems that I see, and one of the things I love about your research is there, and we're going to figure out a way to make it available to listeners so that they can read it for themselves. And we'll talk offline about how to do that. But the key about your research is you don't set out to prove a point for yourself. There's so many researchers out there who their number one goal is either A, they're trying to convince the halls of English literature departments across academia that they're wrong and the Oxfordian researcher is right, which is a stupid goal and a worthless goal, and it hasn't worked for 100 years. Or B, they're trying to be the smartest person in the room at the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship Conference. And both of those are so short-sighted and so ego-driven and so antithetical to what it is that we're trying to accomplish. I've been criticized for this program as being it's not scholarly enough, and too many things go out there that aren't supported by footnotes and documentation. And excuse me, that doesn't matter to my listeners. And it shouldn't matter to the movement until people are so invested that then they get into the weeds. I try to stay out of the weeds. I'm an entertainer. I'm not a scholar. I never pretended to be a scholar. I'm an entertainer. I'm trying to create an entertaining podcast that interests people in this topic so that they can go read the work of the scholars, so that they can go find their own truth. And my belief is that the content we're producing as Oxfordians, as the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship as an organization, the content should be produced not for each other, but for the global audience. We've been spending too much time patting each other on the back for our accomplishments and our wonderful new papers and our fabulous essays presented at conferences where 120 people are sitting in the room. We need to reach 120 million people. And the only way we can do that is creating content that is more easily accessible, more palatable, more intriguing, and most importantly, more entertaining to a wider global audience. And that's something that I hope to accomplish continuously moving forward, not only with this program, but with other things that I'm working towards. we need to get away from the insular, cliquish, elitist, club-like mentality that has bogged this movement down for far too long. And, we've seen that throughout history. We saw it in Elizabeth's England. We saw it with Elizabeth herself and the entire succession issue that I believe created the name of Shakespeare in the first place. And we're seeing it in the halls of government across the globe. If Vladimir Putin isn't a fading old lion who is afraid his legacy is going to dissolve before he can finish it, before he dies, well, then I don't know what that is, because that's what it looks like to me. And we see it in full splendor among Oxfordians, this what I like to call fading lion's disease or fading lion syndrome. It's time for the old lions to step aside and let the new young lions take over the pride. And perhaps we can all join in the pride of seeing some progressive forward movement accomplished.
Well, Steven, I think you definitely made some very good points. Concerning my research, I just have to point out that I've indeed concluded my work. I do not intend to do any more research into the whole authorship question because, okay, this may sound a little bit egotistical, but it's basically I have what I want. And Steven, I'm very methodical. I'm very systematic. I work with it may seem like a complex system. Some people may even consider that these are just philosophical platitudes or subtleties. They're not. They are the very essence of understanding if a proposition is true, false, or is neither true or false, which simply we don't have enough data to understand its logical value. Now, I don't think it's really important whether I'm a professor or a doctor. I don't think it's really something relevant to this question because in this, I'm not even a native English speaker. Steven, I've never had an English literature class in my life. I have never heard Shakespeare mentioned at school. I learned English basically with a dictionary and the plays of Shakespeare. Yeah, it's true. So I don't exactly know how my research, if we want to just go by seniority, how my research would stand against the others. But I can promise you one thing. If I put my research and I compare it with any other research done on the same subject, I think that the effect would be the same as when a ball made of iron, that's my research, hits a ball made of glass. I think it's pretty obvious what I intend to say through this, because in fact, there is a lot of research out there that is really not valid. And that's why I had to start, when I started my work, with a very strict system and method. And it's basically all down to the scientific method. And we have to evaluate 4 concepts, which is the possibility, the probability, the plausibility, and the reality of a thesis. As long as it is not reality, the thesis has fallen. As long as it's based on deduction, not induction, I don't really care. I consider it spurious work because from the logical point of view, premises can be wrong with a valid conclusion, with a conclusion giving true. So I only need a single document to study and to understand Shakespeare, which is the Shakespearean canon. All my work is inducted from the Shakespearean canon. I don't start from Elizabethan history, which seems to me a little bit awkward, because this whole question, if it hinges on misattribution of authorship, okay, so I actually don't admit anything of English history, but I'm going to start from English history to prove a certain point connected to the canon. This is nonsense. I don't admit Elizabethan letters. I don't admit anecdotes. These are all very spurious. If you want to start, you start from the canon, because the author and the canon are simply one. And of course, along the lines, you have to evaluate a proposition through the principle of sufficient reason. Now, this is a lot more complex, but basically, Stephen, I'm describing my system. Another important thing is I assume everything, every single thing that has been said about Shakespeare, about the Vere, or about the Elizabethan court, I assume it to be false until I have actually proven it true. Then I accept nothing on authority. If I want to prove a thesis, I will proceed independently, because I'm an independent scholar, and I will cut no corners. If the conclusions are salacious, they're not convenient, it really doesn't matter to me, because I love the work of Shakespeare. I set out to understand the plays and the man. It would even surprise you, Stephen. Perhaps it will surprise you. I don't even know that much about De Vere. I confess this. I read a lot of biographies on De Vere, but when I'm doing my deconstruction work, I almost have to forget about De Vere, because I'm proceeding from the canon. I intend to prove Shakespeare as De Vere, not the other way around. And there's a very important point, I think it should be mentioned, which is it does not constitute valid research to use immanent faculties in a transcendent use. This is not valid research. There are things that can be known, and there are things that cannot be known. If things cannot be known, there's no way to speculate. And finally, the thing that I consider most important is the degree of probability. When is exactly the authorship question solved? The authorship question is solved when there is a full mathematical probability of 100% of linking any single play of the canon to the life of De Vere. When this is achieved, or it has been achieved, it means that by extension, the whole of the Shakespearean canon is of this author. And therefore, the whole question is concluded. That's qui id, quod erat demonstrandum. Thus have I proven. And it's a very thorough system. It has never let me down. And I wish that my coming onto your show might encourage other scholars to follow this very same path, because what I did, Stephen, I would say I actually did it for those like yourself that are interested and love this question and love Shakespeare and love the works. And by putting this out there, maybe someone will actually find something that I haven't found yet. And believe you me, I'm sure there's a lot of things that I haven't found. And then we can all understand better this extraordinary work of genius.
Well, thank you so much, Luis. I think you have brought a very different perspective to our listeners about how this question should be approached. I think you're taking the time to explain your research as well as your methodology is super important, as well as your unique perspective. And, you know, I will remind listeners at the top of the program when we introduced you, you're responsible for tens of billions of dollars worth of construction throughout the world. And if you build a skyscraper and you make one error, it can all come crumbling down on a lot of people. So I understand your emphasis on detail and precision and the mathematical and architectural background that you bring to this. And I think that that's something that has been lacking in a lot of areas. And as you point out, too many people are trying to prove that De Vere was Shakespeare. And what they need to be proving is that Shakespeare is De Vere. And that may sound like semantics, but if you think about that deeply, you'll understand the difference, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank you for taking this time with me all the way from Portugal. This is going to be one of, I believe, the longest episodes we've ever recorded, and definitely well worth it. Before we wrap things up, I have a little business to conduct. Don't forget, Quiller Nation, you can show off your Quiller pride with a Quiller t-shirt, coffee mug, or other neat item by placing your order in the swag shop today. New items are going to be on their way, by the way. I just ordered another t-shirt out of the swag shop just this week, and it has the multiple facts, including De Vere was Shakespeare. In August, I'll be traveling to New York to meet with one of our favorite guests, my friend Hank Whittemore. Together, Hank and I will sit down and we'll record multiple episodes and bonus features. Yes, bonus features. Don't forget, you have to subscribe at the right level in order to unlock those bonus features. We're going to be working together as well on his monodrama titled Shakespeare's Treason, with the goal of converting it into a piece that can be played by any actor anywhere in order to encourage productions of it across the country. Because as I said, we need content that appeals to people on every level, especially those who are just being introduced to this. Annie and I are finalizing the adapted script for our staged reading of Venus and Adonis, which will soon be becoming a new bonus feature for you Quillers out there. So be watching for that. And remember, if you want to write to me, you can do so. Send me your comments, your suggestions, your ideas, your criticisms to contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com, contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com. Let's keep this conversation going. And make sure you visit don'tquillthepodcast.com. Click that Patreon link to see a variety of exclusive perks available only to patrons and your chance to enter the drawing for the Quiller of the Month. Here to further explain the Patreon levels and how it all works is our very own producer Jake.
Thank you so much, Steven, and hello, Quillers. I won't take up too much of your time here. We just want to talk quickly about the Patreon. We're making some slight adjustments as we are continuing to learn and grow and figure out the best way to give back to those who are kind enough to show their support for this little podcast. So the Patreon, of course, still offers 5 tiers. Official Quillers get patron recognition. Very important Quillers, aka VIQs, they get patron recognition and an exclusive shop discount. And serial Quillers not only get bonus monthly material, but now also get entry into the Quiller of the Month contest. Each and every month, we randomly select one of our eligible Quillers and name them Quiller of the Month, and that person gets some free merch from the shop and, of course, their recognition on the show. We wanted to extend that to more people so that it's a more fun contest that more people have the ability to win. So now Noble Quillers have 2 times entry into the Quiller of the Month contest, and Quiller Royalty have 3 times entry into the contest, plus those milestone rewards that are exclusive to Quiller Royalty based on how long you remain royalty. Thanks again to everybody who continues to show their support for this little podcast. Your patronage really does help us continue to grow the show, helps us keep the lights on, and we hope that you enjoy these little bonus perks that you get for that support. Thanks again. Of course, you can find all of this at patreon.com/don'tquillthemessenger or by clicking the Patreon link at don'tquillthepodcast.com. Now let's wrap this show up, Steven.
Thank you, Jake. We appreciate that. And until next time, fellow Quillers, say it with me out loud so that everyone around you can hear it. 1, 2, 3. Keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at don'tquillthepod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com. don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.